Get out. The words hit Catherine Shepard like a slap across the face, delivered not with cruelty but with something far worse: quiet, practiced authority. Oliver Abbott stood in the doorway of her modest boarding room at Hattie Mee's establishment on the edge of Redrock Flats, Arizona territory, his deputy's star catching the dying amber light of a Sunday evening in October of 1882. His jaw was set. His hazel eyes, which Catherine had spent the better part of 3 weeks learning to read like weather on the horizon, were deliberately blank. He was holding an official document. She already knew what it said before he unfolded it, because she had been waiting for something like this since the moment she arrived in this town. Still, knowing did not dull the blade. "You are being formally escorted to the territorial boundary," Oliver said, his voice carrying none of the warmth she had come to rely on during their long afternoon conversations on Hattie Mee's porch, or the quiet laughter they had shared over coffee and dried apple pie at the Redrock diner. "Sheriff Crane has signed the order. You have until morning to collect your belongings. I will accompany you as far as the Maricopa Junction, where you will board the eastbound stage." Catherine stared at him for a long moment. The lamp behind her threw her shadow forward, long and dark across the floorboards between them. She felt the betrayal of it settle into her chest like a stone dropped into deep water, heavy, sinking, final. "And you agreed to this," she said, not a question. Something moved behind his careful blankness. It was fast, a crack in a frozen river there and gone. "It's my job," he said. "Of course it is." Her voice was very calm. She had learned calm the hard way, in places far rougher than Redrock Flats, under circumstances that would have broken someone with a softer spine. "Then I suppose you had better let me pack." She turned away from him before her face could betray anything she did not want him to see. Behind her, she heard him take a single step into the room and then stop himself. She heard the exhale he kept controlled and even. She heard him fold the document and slide it back into his vest pocket, heard the faint metallic whisper of the badge against the fabric. She heard him leave. And only when she was absolutely certain, his boots had carried him all the way down the creaking staircase, and out into the street below did Catherine Shepard sink onto the edge of the narrow bed, press both hands over her mouth, and allow herself exactly 30 seconds of the grief she could not afford. Then she straightened her spine and started to think. 3 weeks earlier, Catherine had arrived in Redrock Flats with $42, a carpet bag containing everything she owned, and a secret she had carried for the better part of 2 years. She had chosen Redrock Flats with some care, the way a person running from something chooses with care. It was small enough to be overlooked by the men she was running from, but large enough to have a post office, a general store, a functioning telegraph line, and enough passing traffic that one woman alone would not be remarkable. It sat in the southern Arizona territory, a sun-hammered little collection of adobe and timber structures arranged along a single main road that turned to powder in drought and mud and rain, with the Superstition Mountains rising jagged and purple to the northeast, and the desert spreading in every direction like something that did not intend to be tamed. She had gone first to the post office, where a woman named Dora Finch had accepted her letter of introduction with squinting skepticism. Then she had gone to Hattie Mee's boarding house, where Hattie herself, a broad-shouldered widow of 50-odd years with an iron handshake and a surprisingly generous heart, had looked her up and down and asked 2 questions. The first was whether she could pay in advance. The second was whether she was carrying trouble. Catherine had answered yes to the first and had paused too long before answering the second, which was answer enough for a woman like Hattie Mee. "Then you will keep your trouble to yourself, keep your door latched at night, and you will not bring it into my house in any manner that causes me difficulty," Hattie had said. "Those are my terms." Catherine had agreed to the terms. She had also, very quietly, assessed every exit from the property. She had been looking for work. She was educated, more educated than most women in the Arizona territory in 1882, which was saying both something and nothing, depending on who you asked. She could read and write in English, French, and passable Latin. She could do accounts. She had worked as a schoolteacher in Missouri, as a bookkeeper in Tucson, and for a brief unhappy period as a secretary to a man in Santa Fe, whose intentions had been both predictable and unwelcome, and from whose office she had resigned with some urgency on a Tuesday morning in August of 1880. It was in Tucson that she had stumbled, in the way that naive people stumble, into knowing something she was not supposed to know. She had been keeping books for a mining concern, doing honest work for what she had believed to be honest wages. Until the afternoon, she had found a second set of ledgers tucked behind the legitimate ones in a locked drawer that had been left carelessly unlocked by a distracted clerk. She had understood what she was looking at immediately, because she was good with numbers, and the numbers were telling a very clear story. The mining concern was a front. The real business was moving stolen cattle across the territorial line, bribing officials, and funneling money to a man named Harlan Goss, who was not a rancher despite what the paperwork said, but was in fact one of the most quietly dangerous men in the Southwest. Catherine had replaced the ledgers exactly as she had found them, and had spent the next 72 hours being absolutely ordinary, and then had collected her wages on Friday, packed her things on Saturday, and been on a stage heading east by Sunday dawn. She had kept moving ever since, always one step ahead of the creeping certainty that Harlan Goss's people were looking for her, because she had been foolish enough, in a moment of moral courage she sometimes wished she could take back, to write a letter to the federal marshal's office in Prescott. The letter had described what she had seen. She had signed it with her full name, because she had not known any better at the time. She had since learned considerably better. Oliver Abbott had not been the first person in Redrock Flats to notice Catherine Shepard. That distinction belonged to Tom Hurley, who ran the general store and had noticed her primarily because she had walked in and bought flour, lamp oil, and a copy of a 3-month-old newspaper from Phoenix without any of the shy, sideways social maneuvering that most new arrivals deployed when establishing themselves. She had simply bought her things, said thank you with precise courtesy, and left. Oliver had noticed her on her third day in town, when she had been sitting on the porch outside Hattie Mee's reading a book in the evening light, and he had been making his rounds. He had been deputy to Sheriff Crane for going on 4 years by then, which meant he knew almost everyone in Redrock Flats and was fluent in the particular social grammar of a small frontier town. He knew which ranchers were having a hard season, which families were feuding over water rights, which cowboys were inclined to drink past their limits on Saturday nights. He knew the rhythms of the place the way a sailor knows the rhythms of his particular stretch of ocean. A woman alone, reading on a porch at sunset, with a carpetbag that suggested she had arrived recently, and a posture that said she was comfortable being alone but was also very aware of everything happening around her, that was not a rhythm he recognized. He had tipped his hat. She had looked up from her book and looked at him with dark brown eyes that were measuring him before she'd even decided to be polite about it, and then had said, "Deputy." "Evening, ma'am," he had said. "New to Redrock." 3 days, she had said. "I have a room at Hattie Mee's. I've paid in advance through the end of the month. I'm looking for bookkeeping work or tutoring if anyone needs it. My name is Catherine Shepard." It had been such a direct little presentation of herself, as if she was anticipating the questions he would ask and had decided to simply answer them in advance, that he had found himself at a slight loss. Most people new to a town were either too eager or too cagey. She was neither. She was simply clear, and it was disarming in a way he had not expected. "Oliver Abbott," he had said. "I'll ask around. There's a few ranching families whose kids could use tutoring. The schoolteacher we had moved on back in May. I would appreciate that," she had said, and returned to her book. He had walked on. He had thought about those dark eyes for the next 2 hours while he finished his rounds, which was 2 hours longer than he generally spent thinking about anything that wasn't his immediate professional concern. He had asked around, as he'd said he would. The Carmichael family, who ran a cattle operation 6 miles out of town, had 3 children who were badly behind on their letters and numbers. Mrs. Carmichael had agreed to meet Catherine, and Catherine had made a good impression. And by the end of her first week in Redrock Flats, she had secured herself an arrangement that would keep her fed and housed for the foreseeable future. Oliver had found himself, in the days that followed, engineering small reasons to pass by Hattie Mees at the hours when Catherine was likely to be on the porch. He was honest enough with himself to recognize what he was doing and disciplined enough to be somewhat ashamed of it. But the honest truth was that he had spent 4 years in Redrock Flats without once feeling whatever this vaguely restless warmth was, and he was not entirely sure what to do with it. He was 28 years old, lean and tall with the kind of weathered good looks that come from a life spent largely outdoors, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that were careful and steady. He had grown up in Colorado, had come to Arizona territory after a season of cattle driving that had convinced him ranching was not the life for him, had taken a job as a deputy somewhat by accident when the previous one had quit abruptly, and had stayed because Redrock Flats had turned out to suit him in ways he couldn't entirely articulate. It was orderly mostly. People largely did right by each other. The work was real. He had not, in 4 years, been seriously involved with anyone. There had been a woman the second year, a widow named Louise who had eventually decided to go back east to her family, and they had parted without much heartbreak on either side, which told him that whatever that had been, it had not been this. This was different from the beginning, and he knew it from the beginning, and that knowledge sat with him uneasily, like something important he needed to figure out the name for. By the end of her second week, they had fallen into a habit. Not anything formal or acknowledged, just an understanding that if she was on the porch in the evenings and he was passing by on his rounds, he would stop for a while and they would talk. They talked about the territory, about books, about the Carmichael children's improving comprehension of long division, about the nature of justice, which was a topic that seemed to matter to both of them more than it did to most people. She had strong opinions, delivered with the calm precision that he was coming to understand was simply how she communicated, not aloofness but focus. She listened when he talked in a way that made him aware, after the fact, that he had said more than he usually said to anyone. He did not know yet what she was running from. He suspected she was running from something, because the calm she maintained was the kind that required effort, and because occasionally, when a rider came into town from an unusual direction or a stranger appeared in the main street, she would go very still in a particular way that he recognized from his years of law work as the stillness of a person calculating threat. He did not press. He believed, or told himself he believed, that it was her business. It was around the beginning of her third week that things began to shift. The shift came quietly, the way the weather in the desert shifts, everything fine and still, and then suddenly the temperature has dropped 10 degrees and there is the smell of rain in the air. It came in the form of a conversation that had started over coffee at the Redrock diner and had lasted through 2 refills and the better part of a golden afternoon. She had been telling him about Missouri, about the school where she had taught, about the particular satisfaction of watching a child work through a problem to its answer and find confidence on the other side of it. He had been watching her face while she talked and had noticed the way it changed when she was genuinely engaged, the careful composure softening into something that was simply and purely alive, and he had thought with very sudden clarity that he wanted to see that look as often as possible for as long as possible, and that this was, by any reasonable measure, a problem. "You left Missouri a while back," he said, because he was testing the edges of something. "About 2 years ago now," she said. She turned her coffee cup on the table. "I went to Tucson first, and then Santa Fe briefly, and then here. That's a lot of moving for someone who seems like she'd prefer to stay in one place." She looked at him. The look was direct and a little careful. "That is a perceptive observation," she said. "I'm a deputy sheriff," he said. I notice things for a living, a small smile. Then I suppose I should be more careful. I'm not asking you to explain yourself, he said. I just want you to know that if there's something I should know for your safety, I'd rather know it. The smile faded, not unpleasantly but seriously. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her weighing something, measuring the distance between trust and exposure. There's something, she said at last. But if I tell you, it becomes your problem too, and I don't think I have the right to do that to you. Maybe, he said, I'd rather it were my problem. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and something passed between them that was too honest and too weighted to be comfortable, and was also undeniably the most real thing he had felt in a very long time. Then she shook her head, a small private motion, and said, "Not yet," and turned to signal the waitress for the bill. He did not push. He paid for the coffee, because she had started to reach for her purse, and he moved his hand first without thinking, and she let him, which was its own small significant thing. They walked back toward Hattie Me's through the warm, dusty afternoon, and he thought about the two words she'd said, "not yet," and the fact that they contained a future in them, a next time, a continuation, and he carried that fact quietly and carefully the rest of the day, the way you carry something fragile. It was 3 days after that afternoon in the diner that everything fell apart. Oliver had not known, when he walked into the sheriff's office that Friday morning, that the letter waiting on Crane's desk would change things so completely. He had not known that the hidden motive he had been half sensing in the margins of Catherine's story was about to be dragged into the open by forces that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with a man named Harlan Goss, and the long, dangerous reach of his interests. Sheriff Crane was a broad, florid man of 55 who had been in Redrock Flats for 11 years, and who ran his office with a combination of genuine competence and a political instinct that sometimes made Oliver quietly uneasy. Crane was not a corrupt man. Oliver had looked for that and hadn't found it, but he was a careful man, a man who thought about the next step and the step after that, a man who sometimes chose the path of least resistance when Oliver would have chosen something harder and more right. Crane had been sitting with the letter for some time when Oliver arrived, which was evident from the way it was creased and the expression on Crane's face. "Shut the door," Crane said. Oliver shut the door and sat across from his employer and waited. "You know the woman staying over at Hattie Me's," Crane said. "The new one, Catherine Shepard." Oliver felt the muscles in his jaw tighten, but his expression did not change. "I know her." Crane studied him. "How well?" "Well enough. She's been here 3 weeks. She's teaching the Carmichael kids. She's a decent person." He paused deliberately. "Why?" Crane slid the letter across the desk. Oliver picked it up. It was from a man named Warren Bale, who presented himself as a representative of the Consolidated Livestock Association, a body that Oliver had encountered in the course of his work and had no particular reason to distrust. The letter stated, with the smooth authority of money and legal positioning, that a woman named Catherine Shepard had been involved in the theft of sensitive business documents from a mining and cattle concern in Tucson, that her presence in any settlement was considered disruptive to the interests of legitimate commerce, and that the signatories would appreciate the cooperation of local law enforcement in ensuring her removal from the territory. It used phrases like pending legal proceedings and material witness, in ways that sounded official without quite making specific claims, and it concluded with a polite suggestion that failure to cooperate could affect certain pending land arrangements that the association had with grazing rights around Redrock Flats. Oliver read it twice. He set it back on the desk with controlled care. "Theft," he said. "That's what it says. It doesn't file a charge. It doesn't name a territory court or a judge. It names a private business association." He met Crane's eyes. "That's not a legal order." "No," Crane said, with the manner of a man who knows this but is thinking about something else. "But those land arrangements they mention are real. Redrock depends on those grazing rights coming through, Oliver. We've got ranching families here whose livelihoods depend on that going smoothly. So we remove a woman from a town she hasn't broken any laws in, Oliver said, because a private business interest with connections to Harlan Goss told us to. Crane's eyes sharpened. How do you know the Goss connection? I pay attention. Crane was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm not asking you to drag her out in chains. I'm asking you to escort her to Maricopa Junction, put her on the eastbound stage and make it civilized. She gets where she's going. She stays out of this territory. Nobody gets hurt. And if she doesn't want to go, then you explain that staying is worse than leaving, which is probably true. Crane folded his hands. I know you've spent some time with her, Oliver. I'm not blind. I am telling you that in this particular situation, your personal feelings cannot be the deciding factor. Oliver looked at the badge on his chest for one long moment. Then he said, I'll do it tonight, stood up, and left the office before he said something he could not take back. He had stood outside for a full 5 minutes in the hot late afternoon sun before he'd walked to Hattie Mee's and knocked on Catherine's door with the document in his pocket, and the forced choice laid out before him like a trap he had stepped into without seeing it was there. Now, standing in the street below her window, he could hear nothing from upstairs. The lamp in her room was lit. He stood with his hands hanging at his sides and thought about the look on her face when he had said, "It's my job." He thought about the way she had turned away from him so deliberately, not in anger, but in something more controlled and more painful than anger. He thought about not yet and the future it had implied, and what that future looked like from where he was standing. He made a decision. It was not the decision Crane had sent him to make. It was the other one, the harder one, the one that would cost him the badge if it went wrong. He was aware of this as he walked back into the boarding house and up the stairs and knocked on Catherine's door a second time. She opened it after a short pause. She was still dressed, had not yet begun to pack, and was looking at him with wariness that cut him in a way that the disapproval of men he respected had never managed. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to listen to it without deciding whether to trust me until I've finished." She considered this for a beat. Then she stepped back from the door and he came in. He told her about the letter. He told her about Warren Bale and the Consolidated Livestock Association and the connection he had drawn to Harlan Goss. He watched her face while he talked and saw precisely the moment when she understood that he already knew enough to understand why she was really here and what she was really running from. "You knew there was something," she said when he finished. "I suspected. I didn't know the shape of it until tonight." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The letter to the federal marshal's office, did they receive it?" "I don't know," he said. "Was there a response?" "Not to me, but I was already moving by the time they would have replied." She sat down on the edge of the bed, the same edge she had sat on in private grief an hour before, and pressed her fingers together in her lap. "If Goss knows where I am, then staying here is dangerous regardless of whether your sheriff forces the issue or not." "I know." "Then what are you suggesting?" She looked at him. The wariness was not gone, but something else was sharing space with it, something that was watching him very carefully for the answer to a question she had not asked aloud. "I'm suggesting," Oliver said, "that I was told to escort you to Maricopa Junction and put you on the eastbound stage. Nobody specified that I couldn't continue in the same direction." The silence stretched. "You would leave your post," she said slowly. "I would take a brief and unofficial leave of absence," he said, with a dryness that was, he realized, a kind of honesty about how desperate the whole thing was. "Long enough to get you to Prescott. The federal marshal's office is there. If you can make a statement in person about what you saw in those ledgers, Goss's people have a reason to back off that doesn't involve making you disappear." Catherine's eyes were steady on him. "You would do this?" "I'm standing here, aren't I, Oliver?" The use of his first name without the formal courtesy of Mr., without the social distance that had always lived in how she'd said it before, that small shift, slight as the tip of a compass needle, turned something in his chest. "This is a significant risk for you." "Yes," he said simply. "The honest question," she said, "is why." He looked at her for a moment. He was not a man who spoke carelessly about things that mattered, which meant he sometimes did not speak at all when he should. He thought about the honest answer to the honest question and decided that if he was already burning his professional standing to ash on her behalf, he might as well be honest about why. "Because 3 weeks ago you told me that telling me would make it my problem," he said. "And I told you maybe I'd rather it were. And I meant it then and I mean it now. That's why." The quiet that followed was different from the earlier quiets. It was warmer, more fragile, more charged. Catherine looked at him with the particular expression he had been cataloging since the first evening on the porch, direct, measuring, alive, and then she stood up. "Then I suppose," she said, "I had better pack." They left before dawn. Oliver had spent the hours between making the decision and making the departure in brisk, practical motion. He had gone to the stable and arranged for 2 horses, his own gelding, a solidly built bay named Jasper, and a roan mare from the livery that could go distance without complaint. He had packed provisions from his own supplies. He had written a note to Sheriff Crane that was honest but not detailed, which would have to be enough. He had also, in the quiet of his small rented room above the tack shop, sat for a while with the weight of what he was doing laid out in front of him. He was defying a direct instruction from his employer. He was, by any strict reading, abandoning his post. He was doing this for a woman he had known for 3 weeks on the strength of a conversation and a look and 2 words, "not yet," that had held a future in them like a seed holds a tree. He was 30 years old, give or take. He should know better than to be moved so completely by something so new. He sat with all of this, and then he stood up and finished packing, because knowing better had nothing to do with it. Catherine was waiting in front of Hattie Mees with her carpet bag, and a second, smaller bag she had apparently stowed under the bed, which told him she had been ready to move quickly at some point and had prepared for it. Hattie Mee herself was standing in the doorway in a robe, arms crossed, watching them with an expression that contained both disapproval and something that might, under different circumstances, have been satisfaction. "You keep yourself safe, girl," Hattie Mee said to Catherine. "I intend to," Catherine said. "And you," Hattie Mee fixed Oliver with a look that he felt in his back teeth, "you behave yourself." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and meant it in ways that she probably was not specifically asking about. They rode out of Redrock Flats in the pre-dawn dark, the desert cooling around them to the particular silver silence that exists just before the sun commits to rising. Catherine rode well, which he had not known but was not surprised by. She sat the roan mare with a quiet competence that did not announce itself, the same way she did everything else. For a while they rode without speaking, which was not an uncomfortable silence. The desert at this hour was something Oliver had always loved, the vast dark softening toward gray, the coyotes finishing their conversations, the stars retreating as the eastern edge of the sky began to lighten behind the mountains. He had grown up in mountain country and still sometimes missed the pines, but he had come to love this landscape too, its austerity, its honesty. It didn't pretend to be anything but what it was. "How long to Prescott?" Catherine asked, when the sky was pale enough to see by. 3 days if we push and nothing goes wrong," Oliver said. The stage road through Maricopa Junction would be the faster route, but if Crane's already sent word or Goss has people watching the stations, "We don't take the stage road," she said immediately. "Agreed. We go north through the valley. It's longer, but it keeps us off the main routes." She nodded. He watched her assess the horizon, those dark eyes moving with the practiced calm of someone who had learned to pay attention to landscapes as a survival tool, and felt, beneath everything complicated and consequential about their situation, a simple, clean appreciation for who she was. She was not soft. She was not helpless. She was in a genuinely dangerous position, and she was meeting it with the same focused intelligence she brought to everything, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, extraordinary. "Tell me about the ledgers," he said. "If we're going to make a case to the federal marshal, I need to understand what you saw." She glanced at him. Then she told him. She had a good memory, the kind that stores numbers like a safe stores valuables, and what she described was detailed and damning. The mining concern, it was called the Meridian Company on paper, had been generating invoices for ore extraction that did not correspond to actual production figures. The discrepancy was being covered by income from cattle, and the cattle figures were too large and too irregular to be legitimate ranch income. There were names of officials, a county clerk, a land agent in Tucson, a contract man whose name appeared on both the legitimate and illegitimate ledgers, and above all of it in the column that accounted for the disbursement of the surplus, a single name and initials, H. Goss. "You memorized all of this," Oliver said. "I am very good with numbers," she said, with the simple precision that he now recognized as her version of pride. "Could you reproduce it in writing, in enough detail to be useful to a federal marshal?" "I've already done it," she said. She patted the smaller bag hanging from her saddle. "It's all in there. Names, figures, dates, everything I could recall. I've been updating it as I've remembered things. It's been 2 years, but numbers stay with me." He looked at her. "You've been carrying that." "For 2 years, yes." He thought about the weight of that 2 years of moving, always one step ahead, carrying documentary evidence of a criminal enterprise in a bag under a boarding house bed, waiting for the moment it might be safe enough to put it in front of the right authority. The courage that required, or the desperation, or the particular combination of both that drives a person to keep going when the sensible choice is to destroy the papers and pretend ignorance and simply let it be. "Why didn't you destroy it?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. The sun had crested the mountains and the desert around them was turning gold and copper, shadow retreating into itself. "Because people were being hurt," she said finally. "Ranching families, losing cattle they couldn't afford to lose, people paying taxes on land that was being illegally leased around them. A system that is already unfair being made worse by men who are profiting from that unfairness. I saw it in the numbers. Every figure on those pages is someone's loss." She paused. "I am a woman alone in the Arizona Territory in 1882 with no family close enough to help and no official standing of any kind. I am aware that my letter to the marshal's office may have disappeared in a drawer somewhere. I am aware that the odds of this mattering are not good. But the alternative is knowing what I know and doing nothing, and I find I cannot do nothing. I have tried and I cannot." Oliver rode beside her, in silence for a moment. He was thinking that he had spent 4 years in Redrock Flats growing increasingly uneasy with the compromises of Crane's practical politics, with the moments where expediency had quietly overridden principle, and that he had always told himself he was staying because the place needed someone who would at least try to do right, and that tonight, for the first time, he had actually acted on that belief in a way that cost something real, and that he was riding into the sunrise of the Arizona desert beside the woman who had been the catalyst for it, who had walked into his town 3 weeks ago with $42 and a carpetbag full of moral clarity, and he thought that sometimes the universe is not subtle about what it is trying to show you. "I believe you," he said. She looked at him. The morning light was in her eyes, which were brown and warm and very direct. "I know," she said quietly. "That is not something I take lightly." They rode on. The first night they made camp in a shallow canyon where a dry creek bed provided level ground and rock walls blocked the wind. Oliver built a small fire, the kind that produces more warmth than flame, and Catherine unpacked the provisions he had brought with the same practical competence she apparently brought to everything. They ate salt pork, hardtack, dried apricots, and drank water from the canteens and sat in the companionable quiet of a fire burning low. "You had your whole life there," Catherine said at some point, not accusingly, just noting it. "Your work, your place in things." "I had a job in a rented room," Oliver said. He poked the fire. "That's not the same as a whole life. You had people who relied on you. Sheriff Crane has 2 other deputies," he said. "The town will not collapse." He glanced at her across the fire. "I made a choice, Catherine. I'd make it again." She looked at him for a long moment over the low orange flames, and the look was full of things she was apparently not yet ready to say aloud. He did not push. He had learned quickly, he thought, because she had a way of teaching things about herself without announcing she was doing it, that Catherine Shepard operated on a schedule of trust that could not be hurried and should not be forced. She would arrive at things in her own time or she would not arrive at them, and either way, rushing her was precisely wrong. "What will you do," she said, "afterward, if this works? If the marshal receives the statement and takes action and it becomes safer?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "That's a strange thing to admit. 4 years in one place, and I realize I've mostly been waiting for something to make my intentions clear. And now," he met her eyes, "now I think I have some intentions that are becoming clear on their own." The quiet that followed was long and warm and full of the fire's soft crackling, and the distant sound of something moving in the brush and the wide desert sky overhead, enormous and dark and scattered with stars that looked, at this distance from any town, like every star that had ever existed. "I haven't trusted anyone in 2 years," Catherine said. It was not a complaint or a self-pity, simply a statement of fact delivered to the fire rather than to him. "I had gotten very good at it, not trusting. It was a habit, and then it was a principle, and then it was just the way things were." A pause. "And then you knocked on my door with an eviction order and offered to throw your career into the desert on my behalf, which was either the most foolish thing I have ever witnessed or the bravest, and I find I cannot determine which." "Possibly both," Oliver said. "Possibly both," she agreed, and the small smile appeared, the one he had been cataloging, the one that turned the composed professional face into something else entirely, and he felt the warmth of it like the warmth of the fire, simple and real and very close. They slept on opposite sides of the fire, which was both the only proper arrangement in the circumstances of 1882 and also something Oliver was privately, somewhat ruefully aware of. He lay on his back with his hat over his face and listened to the quiet and thought about the woman sleeping 15 feet away from him and thought that he was in a considerable amount of trouble of the best possible kind. The second day was harder. Oliver had been watching their back trail since the moment they left Redrock Flats, because the habits of 4 years of law work do not turn off simply because you've switched sides of an argument. It was around mid-morning of the second day, when the sun was high and the land had opened out into a broad flat basin between low ridges, that he saw the dust. "Don't look yet," he said quietly. "Riders behind us. 2, possibly 3, about a mile and a half back." He watched her hands on the reins stay steady. She did not look. "How long have they been there?" "I noticed the dust about 20 minutes ago. They could have picked us up at first light from the high ground east of the canyon." "Goss's men, or cranes sent to intercept," he said. "Either way, we need to move." He assessed the terrain ahead. "There's a Tohono O'odham village about 6 miles north. I've traded there before, they know me. If we can reach it, we have options." "Then let's not waste time talking about it," she said, and urged the roan forward without another word. They rode hard. The roan was a good horse and covered ground well, and Jasper was built for endurance, and they had the advantage of a head start. Oliver kept checking the back trail as they went, calculating the gap. The riders behind were pushing harder now. They had been spotted turning north, had understood something was wrong, and had moved from unhurried follow to active pursuit. The village appeared in the middle distance, a cluster of adobe buildings and brush shelters arranged around a central well, with fields along a shallow seasonal creek that was still running late in the season. Oliver had been here perhaps a dozen times over his 4 years in the territory, trading, passing information, once rendering assistance after a dispute with a neighboring landowner who had been trying to fence off the creek access. He knew the village's headman, a quiet, dignified man named Esteban, who had lived through enough of the territorial government's promises to be appropriately skeptical of Anglo law enforcement, but who had extended Oliver a measured, provisional trust. He slowed Jasper to a walk as they came into the edge of the village, which was correct protocol. Catherine matched his pace without being told. Esteban appeared at the door of the central building as they dismounted. He was a man of perhaps 60, lean and observant, with silver-threaded hair and the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who do not waste anything. "Abbott," he said, not a greeting exactly, an acknowledgement. "Esteban," Oliver said, "we have riders behind us. I need a place to get off the trail for a couple of hours." Esteban's dark eyes moved to Catherine. He looked at her with the same measuring attention that Oliver had recognized in her own gaze the first time they'd met, people who assess rather than assume. "Your family?" Esteban asked Oliver, with what might have been a slight emphasis. "Not yet," Oliver said, and was aware immediately that this was a more honest answer than the situation strictly required. Something shifted in Esteban's expression. "Bring the horses around back," he said. They were given water and shade and the quiet practicality of Esteban's people, who went about their business around them without curiosity or comment. A woman brought food, dried venison, and something made with ground corn that was filling and good, and Catherine ate, and then sat with her back against the adobe wall and watched the trail they had come in on with her careful dark eyes. "They won't come into the village," Oliver said, settling beside her. "Not without cause they can state publicly. They're not official law, they're private men, and whatever authority they claim, they can't compel cooperation from a Tohono O'odham community without more standing than they have." "You know a lot about the legal limits of private authority," she said. "4 years of Crane's practical politics has been educational," he said dryly. Then more seriously, "Also it matters that the law be applied correctly, all of it, not just the parts that benefit white men with grazing rights." She looked at him. "You mean that?" "I mean it every day, and then I go back to an office where it gets compromised every day," he said. "Which is probably why I was not entirely sorry for the excuse to leave." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When we get to Prescott, if the marshal acts on the statement, if this works." She turned to look at him fully, which was something she did rarely, the full direct attention of those dark eyes aimed at him without any of the lateral deflection she sometimes used when things were becoming real. "What do you want?" The question hung between them in the warm adobe shade, sincere and weighted. "I want to still be in the same place you are," he said. "That's the first want. The rest of it I can figure out as I go." The crack in her composure that followed was small and brief and wholly genuine, a softening, a catching, something that might in different company have been the beginning of tears, but in Catherine Shepard's case was simply and honestly the expression of a person who has been very alone for a very long time being told that someone wants to fix that. She turned her face away after a moment and looked back at the trail. "All right," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "All right." They left the village after 2 hours. Esteban had confirmed what Oliver suspected. The riders had circled north, not entered the village, and had eventually continued west along the main trail, apparently concluding that their quarry was further ahead. Whether they would backtrack was uncertain, but the delay had restored their advantage. The rest of the second day passed without incident but not without significance. The terrain grew more complex as they moved north, the flat basin giving way to low hills and then proper rocky country, the kind of riding that required attention and took most of the conversational energy out of the air and replaced it with the physical intimacy of shared focus. They navigated together, reading the landscape and each other's cues, and Oliver noticed how naturally they fell into a kind of wordless coordination. She would spot water sign before he did. He would read the best line through broken rock, and they adjusted to each other without discussion. That evening they camped in a more sheltered spot, a notch between 2 boulders with a clear view in all directions and good natural cover. The fire was smaller than the night before. They were closer to Prescott now, which meant they were closer to the resolution of everything, which cast a particular quality of light over the evening, something both hopeful and slightly sorrowful, the way the last day of a significant journey always contains its ending in every moment. "In Missouri," Oliver said, watching the fire, "what was the school like?" she told him. She told him about the one-room schoolhouse with its rows of mismatched benches, and the drafty winter, and the summer heat, and the children who came in varying states of willingness, and the particular triumph of the ones who arrived hostile and left curious. She told him about a boy named Henry who had convinced himself he could not read and who, at the age of 12, had decoded his first full paragraph with such visible shock and joy that the entire class had burst into spontaneous applause, including Catherine herself, which was not the reserved professional behavior expected of a teacher but was completely uncontrollable. Oliver laughed hearing this, a real laugh, full and unguarded. "What?" she said, smiling. "You love it," he said. "Teaching. You love it completely, and the professional demeanor is real, but it's also a container. And things like that moment with Henry overflow the container." "That is an extremely specific observation," she said, the smile still there. "I have been paying attention," he said. It was the same phrase he had used that day in the diner, 3 weeks ago in another lifetime, and she heard the echo of it clearly, and her smile changed, deepened, became something more personal. "I know you have," she said softly. "I've been paying attention too." The admission settled between them like something finding its right place. Oliver looked at her across the small fire, and she looked back at him. And the distance between them, which had been maintained through 3 weeks of careful propriety and 2 days of close travel, was suddenly very aware of itself. "Catherine," he said. "Yes," she said, "just that." He moved around the fire and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, the warmth of her proximity distinct from the warmth of the fire. He was aware, as he had been aware since the beginning, of the year and the territory and everything that propriety required, and he was also aware, as he had been since the beginning, that those considerations were not the only ones in play. He turned toward her and she turned toward him, and he lifted one hand to her face, just the lightest touch of his thumb at the edge of her jaw, asking, and she answered by leaning slightly into the touch with the gravity and tenderness of someone who has been very careful for a very long time and has decided, all at once, to be careful about something different. He kissed her. Softly, briefly, with all the respect and all the longing that had been building since the evening on the porch, since the coffee in the diner, since not yet. She kissed him back with the same quality of intention, deliberate, real, unhurried. When they separated, the fire had burned lower and the stars were enormous overhead, and neither of them said anything for a while because nothing needed to be said. Eventually Catherine said, "We should sleep. Long ride tomorrow." "Yes," Oliver said, and did not move for another full minute. She laughed quietly into the dark air between them. He stood up and went back to his side of the fire and lay down and did not sleep for some time, which was entirely acceptable and entirely worth it. The third day they reached Prescott by late afternoon. The capital of the Arizona Territory in 1882 was a proper town, larger and more substantial than Redrock Flats, with permanent buildings of stone and timber, a courthouse, a newspaper, a hotel with actual amenities, and the federal marshal's office situated on the main street in a building that announced its official purpose with clean-painted signage and a flag. Oliver had been here twice before on official business with Crane, and knew roughly how the office operated and who occupied it. The marshal on duty that afternoon was a man named George Alderman, a federal appointment in his mid-40s, with the lean economy of a man who has spent his career taking difficult situations seriously. Oliver had met him once briefly, and had formed the impression of someone who was not easily impressed, but was also not political in the way Crane was political. They went directly to the marshal's office. Oliver had not telegraphed ahead, because he did not know if the telegraph lines were being watched, which was paranoid and also entirely reasonable given what they knew about the resources Goss could deploy. They simply walked in, and Oliver stated their business at the desk with the directness of a man who has thought carefully about what he is going to say. Alderman came out to see them. He looked at Oliver's badge, which Oliver had kept on somewhat by habit and somewhat on principle, and he looked at Catherine and he said, "Deputy from where?" Redrock Flats, Oliver said, although that appointment may have lapsed by this point depending on Sheriff Crane's current opinion of me. Alderman's expression did not change. And the business? This woman sent you a letter approximately 2 years ago from Tucson, Oliver said, regarding a mining and cattle operation with connections to Harlan Goss. I believe the letter may not have reached the right desk because no action appears to have been taken. She now has documentation and is prepared to make a formal statement. Alderman's eyes moved to Catherine. Your Shepard, Catherine Shepard, she said. I have a written account of what I witnessed which I can supplement with an oral statement. I have names, figures, and dates spanning approximately 18 months of the operation's activities. Alderman was quiet for a moment, looking at them both in the particular way of a man assessing weight and credibility. Come into my office, he said. What followed was 3 hours of careful, thorough testimony. Alderman had a deputy present to record the statement, and he asked questions that were precise and probing, the questions of someone who knows what actual evidence looks like, and is testing to see if this meets the standard. Catherine answered every question with the same clear precision she brought to everything, referring to her written notes where specific figures were needed and speaking from memory where dates and names were concerned. Oliver sat to the side and watched Alderman's face and read in it, slowly over the course of the hours, a shift from careful neutrality to something more engaged, more intent. The letter you sent in 1880, Alderman said at one point. I want to be direct with you, Miss Shepard. It was received. It was reviewed at the time and the decision was made not to act on it because it represented a single, unverified account with no supporting documentation. Catherine held very still. I see. The documentation you have brought today changes that assessment significantly, Alderman said. If the figures you have provided can be corroborated, and there are other threads of investigation that have been running separately, this could constitute sufficient grounds for a federal prosecution. Oliver watched Catherine take this in. He watched her process, with the composure that had survived 2 years of hidden motive and forced choice and constant exposure to a system that was not designed to hear what she was saying, the information that the thing she had carried all this time might actually matter, might actually work. How long would corroboration take? She asked, voice steady. Weeks, possibly months, Alderman said, and I would need you to be available for further questioning if things develop, which means staying in Prescott. That is acceptable, she said. There is a risk, Alderman continued, directly but not without something like apology in his manner. If Goss becomes aware that a formal investigation is underway, there may be pressure applied. On you and potentially on this deputy, who I imagine has already attracted some attention. He has, Oliver said. I want to be honest with you both about what you are walking into, Alderman said. But I also want to be honest about what your evidence represents. This is significant. If this goes where I believe it can go, there are people in this territory who have been waiting a long time for this case. They left the marshal's office as the sun was going down over the Prescott Mountains, the sky turning the particular burning gold of the Arizona high country at dusk. Catherine stood on the boardwalk outside and breathed slowly and deeply, the air of a woman who has been holding something at the very center of herself for 2 years and has, finally, been allowed to set it down. Oliver stood beside her. After a while, she said, I didn't believe it would work. Not really. I hoped, but I did not believe. It worked, he said. It worked, she agreed. And then, with a small, quiet, wholehearted laugh that he had not heard from her before, full and genuine and entirely uncontrolled. It actually worked. He put his arm around her shoulders, without ceremony, and she leaned into him, and they stood on the boardwalk in the gold October evening watching the street of Prescott go about its business, and he thought that this was a moment he would remember in full detail for the rest of his life. They stayed in Prescott, not as a temporary measure, but as the beginning of something permanent, which they both understood without having to formalize it immediately. Oliver found work with a small stock detective agency that operated under legitimate federal charter, doing exactly the kind of investigative work that his years as a deputy had suited him for, but in the service of a cleaner kind of justice than Crane's office had always managed. The work took him out of Prescott sometimes, for days at a stretch, and he always came back and she was always there, which was a fact he never stopped being glad about. Catherine established herself quickly in Prescott, the way a capable woman establishes herself when given a fair chance and a stable environment. She found tutoring work almost immediately, and then a position keeping accounts for a dry goods merchant who recognized a genuine talent when he found one, and then a part-time arrangement with the new public school that was being organized for the fall of 1883. She was good at all of it and happiest at the last, because she loved teaching the way Oliver had said she did completely, with the professional composure, and the overflow that she had given up pretending was not there. The federal investigation moved at the pace federal investigations moved, which was not fast, but it moved. Alderman was thorough and he was good at his work, and over the course of the winter of 1882 into 1883, the case against Harlan Goss and the Meridian Company and all its satellite arrangements built itself on the foundation of Catherine's testimony and the additional corroborating evidence that her document had pointed toward. In March of 1883, Harlan Goss was indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of fraud, cattle theft, and bribery of territorial officials. Warren Bale, whose letter had set the whole business in motion, was named as a co-conspirator. Oliver received word of the indictment on a Thursday morning and went directly to the schoolhouse where Catherine was teaching and waited on the steps outside until the class was dismissed, and then told her what had happened, and watched her face in the afternoon sunlight go through something that was too large and too complex to be called simple happiness, but that contained happiness in it the way a river contains water. "It's done," she said. "Not the trial yet," he said carefully, "but the indictment is done." "It's done," she repeated firmly, and he understood that what she meant was that the 2 years of running was done, the hidden motive and the forced choice and the trapped feeling of carrying something dangerous alone in the world, that was done. Whatever came next, it came next as something else, something that was not running. "Yes," he said, "it's done." She took his hand, there on the schoolhouse steps in the middle of the afternoon, in full view of several passing citizens of Prescott, Arizona territory, which was an act of such deliberate publicness for a woman of her usual reserve that it struck him with the force of a declaration. He held her hand back, equally publicly. It was on a Saturday evening in April of 1883 that Oliver sat across from Catherine at the table in the small house they had separately rented and were increasingly sharing the domestic facts of, over a meal she had cooked because she liked to cook, and he was honest about his limitations in that area, and said the thing he had been building toward since a porch in October. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because we're already," he gestured at the shared meal, the shared evenings, the comfortable domestic territory they had wandered into without formal authorization, but because I want the formal thing too. I want the whole of it. All the legal and permanent and declared aspects of it." He paused. "I am aware this is not the most romantically articulated proposal in history. It's a very precise proposal," Catherine said, "which I find I prefer." "Catherine." "Yes," she said. "Oliver, yes, of course, yes." The wedding was held in May of 1883 in the small Episcopal church on the north end of Prescott's Main Street, on a Saturday afternoon when the weather was perfect, which it often was in the Arizona high country in May. It was a modest ceremony. Aldermen attended, which surprised Oliver and touched him. A few of the teachers from the new school attended, women who had become, carefully and genuinely, Catherine's friends. The merchant who employed her came with his wife. Hattie Me sent a letter, which arrived 2 days before the wedding, having somehow followed the news of their whereabouts in the way news does when it needs to find you. The letter said, in Hattie Me's broad, direct handwriting, "I knew from the first look at that man that he was going to be your trouble. I hope he is the right kind." which Oliver read and laughed and folded into his vest pocket and kept there for considerably longer than was strictly necessary. Sheriff Crane sent nothing, which was expected and was not the source of the hurt it might have been, because Oliver had made his peace with Crane over the course of the winter in the way you make peace with a chapter that is finished. Crane was not a bad man. He was a careful man who had made the choices careful men make in systems that reward caution. Oliver had made different choices and would make them again. They honeymooned, such as it was, with 3 days in a cabin in the mountains east of Prescott that was lent to them by a colleague of Oliver's who used it for hunting in the fall. The mountains were still touched with the last cold nights of spring, the forest quiet and enormous, the sky at altitude a shade of blue that Oliver had not seen since Colorado. Catherine stood at the edge of a meadow on the second morning and looked at the peaks and looked at him and said, "I feel like I can breathe." "The altitude," he said. "No," she said, smiling. "Not the altitude." He understood. He felt it too, the expansion, the loosening of something that had been held tight for a long time in both of them. The running was over. The secrets were out. The hidden motive was in a federal court document, and the dark past was becoming simply the past, which is a different and much less dangerous thing. The trial of Harlan Goss began in September of 1883 in the federal courthouse in Prescott. It lasted 11 days. Catherine testified on the 4th day, in a courtroom that was full in the manner of a small capital city attending to important business, and she was on the stand for 2 hours and answered every question with the same clear, precise, documented accuracy she had demonstrated in Alderman's office a year before. Oliver sat in the gallery and watched her and thought that she was the most formidable person he knew, which was not a thought that diminished the warmth he felt watching her, but was in fact inseparable from it. Harlan Goss was convicted on 14 counts. Warren Bale entered a plea arrangement. The county clerk and the land agent named in the ledgers were charged separately and dealt with in subsequent proceedings. The Meridian Company was dissolved, and its false accounts were entered into the permanent record of the territory's legal history. After the verdict was read, Catherine came out of the courthouse into the September sunshine and found Oliver waiting on the steps, and she walked straight into his arms without preamble and held on, and he held on back, and they stood that way in the warm afternoon while the crowd of the curious and the satisfied moved around them, and the Arizona territory went on being enormous and sun-bright and complicated and real around them. "We should celebrate," Oliver said, into her hair. "We absolutely should," she said. They went to the best restaurant in Prescott, which was not the best restaurant in the world but which had tablecloths and wine imported from California and a cook who was genuine in his ambitions, and they ate a meal that cost more than their usual weekly budget combined and did not care at all. They talked all through it about everything and nothing, about the winter coming and whether it would be bad, about the school and the new curriculum Catherine was designing, about a ranch property Oliver had heard about from a colleague that was perhaps a day's ride from Prescott in a valley with good water and decent land. "Are you thinking about ranching?" Catherine asked. "I'm thinking about something more permanent than rented rooms," he said. "Something that's ours and stays ours." He looked at her over the candlelight. "You'd have a proper house, and a garden if you want one, and the school is close enough to keep the work you have." "And you'd still ride?" she asked, meaning his detective work. "Some, less maybe. A man with a real stake in a piece of land has a reason to be home." He said this carefully because the next thing he was going to say was careful worthy. "And if there are children, he has more reasons." Catherine set down her fork. She looked at him across the candlelight with an expression he could not entirely read, which was unusual because he had become very good at reading her. "Are you thinking about children?" she said, not quite a question. "I'm thinking about all of it," he said. "The full life with you, whatever shape it takes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I would like that very much." And the expression he hadn't been able to read resolved itself into something clear and whole and very happy, and he reached across the table and took her hand, which she gave him with the same easy deliberateness she had given it on the schoolhouse steps. They bought the ranch property in the spring of 1884. It was not large, a modest acreage in the valley Oliver had described, with a stone house that needed work but had good bones, a barn in better condition than the house, a creek that ran reliably because it was fed by mountain snowmelt, and land that the previous owner had partially cleared and partially fenced. Oliver rode the boundaries on their first day and came back to find Catherine standing in the middle of the house's main room looking at the proportions with the expression of someone seeing a thing's potential more clearly than its current state. "The windows face east," she said. "Yes," he said. "Morning light in the kitchen," she said. "That's good." "I thought so," he said. He had looked at perhaps a dozen properties and had chosen this one partly on the strength of the east-facing kitchen windows, and had not said so to anyone because it seemed a small thing. Hearing her say it, he felt the private satisfaction of two people who had developed a language without having to invent it. They spent the spring and early summer fixing the house. Oliver had working knowledge of adobe repair, acquired by observation over 4 years in the territory, and Catherine turned out to have a surprisingly confident hand with carpentry, learned from a father who had believed that useful skills were not gender-specific. They worked on it in evenings, and on the weekend days when Oliver wasn't riding and Catherine wasn't teaching, and it became the most domestic and cheerful period of Oliver's adult life, without quite announcing itself as such. There was plaster dust and disagreement about where to put the shelving, and a particularly memorable afternoon involving a roof repair that went significantly wrong before it went right. And through all of it the house was becoming theirs, absorbing their argument and their laughter and their common effort, and becoming something that had not existed before. In July, Catherine told him she was expecting. She told him on a quiet evening, sitting on the front step of their mostly finished house with the last light going over the mountains and the valley stretching out below them, gold and green and very still. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, and he sat with the information for a moment while it became real, which it did quickly and completely, and with a force that he had not anticipated, because you never quite anticipate the force of things like this even when you have said you want them. "When?" he asked. "February," she said, "if I'm calculating correctly, which I generally am." He laughed, a sudden surprised laugh that contained everything. Then he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat in the fading light for a long time, not talking, because there was nothing to say that needed saying. Everything was right here. The baby came in the last week of February 1885, as Catherine had calculated, during a night that was cold by Arizona standards and very quiet outside, with the mountains white with the season's snowfall and the creek frozen at its edges. Oliver was present for all of it, which was not always the custom, but was absolutely not negotiable in his mind, and the birth was attended by a Prescott doctor named Holloway and a midwife named Mrs. Reyes, who had delivered half the babies in the valley and was competent and matter-of-fact, and whom Catherine had chosen herself after a rigorous comparative process that had made Oliver feel much better about everything. The baby was a boy. Oliver held him for the first time in the early morning light, the cold February dawn coming in through the east windows of the room, exactly as the morning light in the kitchen had come in through the east windows of that room since their first morning in this house. And he thought that a person can know intellectually that love expands to contain what it needs to contain, but the actual experience of it is a different matter entirely and cannot be predicted. It was enormous. It was clean. It was the most specific feeling he had ever had. They named him James, after no one in particular and both of them together, a name that felt right in the way the house had felt right, and the valley had felt right, and Catherine herself had felt right from the moment she'd looked up from her book on a porch in Redrock Flats and said his title with that measuring, direct brown gaze. James Abbott grew up in the Valley House with the east-facing kitchen and the mountain view and the creek that ran reliably, which was a good place to grow up. He was curious and persistent, with his mother's facility for numbers and his father's habit of reading the landscape, and he had his mother's dark eyes and his father's tall, lean build and his own particular self that was entirely his. Oliver taught him to ride when he was 4. Catherine taught him to read when he was 3, because he had asked, and she saw no reason to wait. By 5, he was making logical complaints about the unfairness of certain situations that Oliver was quietly very proud of even when they were directed at him. 2 years after James, Catherine told Oliver she was expecting again. This time she told him at the kitchen table over breakfast, over coffee with the morning light coming in the east windows, and he spilled his coffee and she laughed, and handed him a cloth with the same calm competence she brought to everything, including unexpected joy. The second child was a girl, born in the summer of 1887, whom they named Eliza Me for Hattie Me, who had written to them irregularly over the years with the same blunt affection she had shown from the beginning, and who received the news of her namesake with a letter that said she was unreasonably pleased about this, and that she was getting on fine, still keeping the boarding house, still throwing out people who bring trouble through her door. Eliza had her mother's composure and her father's humor, and a voice that, from approximately 18 months onward, could fill a room more effectively than anyone else in the family, including Oliver when he was making a formal professional point. The Arizona Territory became a state. The territory itself was working toward statehood in those years, though full statehood would not come until 1912, which was still in the future, and the country around them was changing, as the frontier always changes, filling in and becoming something different, the wildness receding before the advance of towns and telegraph lines and railroad spurs, and the long machinery of civilization making the desert smaller than it had been. Oliver watched this with the mixed feeling of someone who had loved the vastness, and who also recognized that vastness had not been an unmixed good for everyone who had lived within it, that Esteban's village and 100 like it had paid, and were paying a price for the civilization that was arriving, and he carried this awareness not as a paralyzing guilt, but as a compass point, something that oriented his sense of justice when it needed orienting. He still did investigative work, though less as the children grew and the ranch became more of a full-time operation. He had, over the years, developed a reputation for competence and a kind of uprightness that was not sanctimonious but was genuine, which brought him work from attorneys and from the federal office, and occasionally from people who simply needed someone they could trust to find something out. Catherine had long since left the dry goods merchants' accounts. She kept their own, meticulously, and taught 3 days a week at the Valley School that had been established when the community grew large enough to warrant one, and she was exactly as good at it as she had always been, and as fulfilled by it as Oliver had known she would be. In the evenings of their life together, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, they read or talked, or sat together on the front step of the house watching the mountain dark and the enormous stars of the Arizona sky overhead. And the quality of the silence between them was the same quality it had always been: warm, real, unhurried, which was the best measure Oliver knew of whether you had found the right person. The silences with the wrong people are always either too empty or too full. With Catherine, they were exactly what they needed to be. One evening, some years into their life at the ranch, Oliver found himself with nothing particularly on his mind, which was a comfortable enough state, sitting in the chair by the lamp reading a 2-week-old newspaper from Prescott, and Catherine was at the table with papers spread before her, doing something involving the school's supply accounts, and James was asleep and Eliza was asleep, and the house was warm and the spring night was cool outside the windows. He looked up from the newspaper and looked at her, at the concentration in her face, the easy competence of her hands moving across the columns, The way the lamplight caught the dark of her hair now touched at the temples with the first threads of gray that he found he loved unreservedly, and thought, with the particular kind of clarity that simple moments sometimes carry, about everything that had brought them here. A letter hidden behind a false ledger. A 2-year journey alone through dangerous territory. A porch in Redrock Flats in October of 1882. A knock on a door with an eviction order and the choice, made in about 10 seconds of looking at her turned away back, to be something other than the instrument of someone else's compromise. Not yet, she had said on that first real evening in the diner when he had asked if she wanted to tell him. And he had taken it as the gift it was, a future implied, a continuation promised, and he had carried it carefully and it had held. "What are you thinking about?" Catherine asked without looking up from her accounts. She had always known when he was thinking rather than reading. "October 1882, he said. She did look up then. Looked at him with those dark eyes that he had been learning to read since the first evening and still occasionally found new depths in. "That was a terrible month," she said, with the small smile that was hers entirely. "It was the best month of my life," he said. "That," she said, "is because you did not have to be the one with the eviction order." He laughed. She smiled wider, set down her pencil, and came to sit on the arm of his chair, which was not its intended purpose but had served this one many times. He put his arm around her waist and she leaned against him, warm and real and here. In this house they had built together in the valley where the creek ran reliably and the morning light came in through the east windows, and the mountains held their snow until spring, and the children were sleeping and the past was simply the past, closed and settled and complete. "Oliver," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm glad you knocked a second time," she said. He held her closer. Outside the window, the spring night of Arizona was enormous and quiet and full of stars that had been there long before any of them and would be there long after. The same stars that had hung over a desert camp where two people had sat on opposite sides of a dying fire and been aware, for the first time and without any pretense, of how much they already meant to each other. "I'm glad you let me in," he said. And that was the whole of it. All the secrets uncovered, all the betrayals answered, all the forced choices resolved into a life that was genuine and full and shared. The dark past become simply history. The forbidden become ordinary and beautiful. The two people who had found each other in the middle of running and danger, and the moral seriousness of a woman who would not let a wrong go unaddressed. Those two people here now in the lamplight, growing old together in a house with east-facing windows, in the valley they had chosen. In the life they had made with their own deliberate hands, the sacrifice had been worth it. It always is, when the thing you sacrifice for is real. And the Arizona territory moved on around them, becoming something new and complicated and ongoing. The frontier closing and the world growing and the desert remaining, vast and honest and full of light, holding its secrets the way deserts always do, patient and enormous and entirely itself. While inside the house the lamp burned warm and steady, and Catherine Shepard Abbott set her accounts aside for the night, and Oliver Abbott put down his newspaper, and the children slept. And everything that had needed to be resolved was resolved, and the night was very quiet, and the stars were very bright, and all was well.